Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the summer course. I'm Professor Rios. This week we move on to Europe, Chapter 9, which is Eurasia or the Russian domain, and the first of the Asian chapters, or the Asian regions. So there's a lot of connectivity between three of these, especially Russia/Eurasia and Central Asia, because Central Asia and parts of Eurasia used to comprise the Soviet Union up until the year 1991. And of course, Europe has been changing essentially for the better part of the last couple of centuries. Obviously, the setting for world wars, the European Union, most recently, the breakup of the European Union as it has stood for a while with Brexit taking place. So it's an area of rather significant interchange, interaction, complexity, cultural exchange, and all kinds of good stuff. So let's begin with the Google Earth presentation. And so here is all three regions as best I could sort of show them from the perspective this week. Again, don't forget, a country like Turkey, we talked about last week how it functions as a bridge between the Middle East and Europe. Turkey would like to be part of the European Union. And if you were to take a survey, more than likely the folks here, closer to Greece, would say that. Whereas the further east you go, the more non-European the country is. It's a very distinctive little rectangle, well, big rectangle actually, that functions as a geographical bridge between two worlds, essentially. Of course, you have Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. These are all former Soviet satellites with the exception of Afghanistan, which never was part of the Soviet Union. Of course, to the north you have Russia itself. Russia, really the biggest country on Earth, the biggest individual country on Earth, which comprises so many different languages and cultures and climates. As you head west, you have Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. These are now independent states which were part of the Warsaw Pact or part of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was still around. Now they're basically European, essentially. But even within these places, the further east you go in the Ukraine, the more European it is. I'm sorry, the more Russian it is. The further west you go, the more non-Russian or maybe more European. So it's a very interesting sort of blending that takes place as you move across these places. Of course, you have Europe, so all the different places that you know, including the former Yugoslavia, now broken up into Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albania and all these different places that used to comprise Montenegro, Kosovo, and so on, that used to be what was once called Yugoslavia. The Mediterranean, of course, Spain and the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal. And if you look at Spain, it's a very distinctive sort of dry, wet climate depending on the season. You really have to go to the west of the peninsula, so Portugal and Galicia, which is right here in the northwest of Spain, to actually find a relatively wet climate. Spain itself is not just Spanish. You have the Basque region centered around Bilbao, and you have the Catalan region, or Catalunya, which is essentially centered in Barcelona. So they speak their own language, Catalan, which is nothing like Spanish, believe me, and the Basque region speaks its own language, and they have their own flag. Now you might say, well, we have our own flags here. New York has a flag, and Texas has a flag, and California has a flag. True, but here they don't think of it as like a little regional flag. They think of it as their flag versus thinking of the Spanish flag as their flag. So it's an interesting area as you head north of the Pyrenees. So this mountain chain that separates France to the north from Spain to the south. You, of course, get into France. And then, of course, you have to the north of that Luxembourg and Belgium and the Netherlands, an area that is so susceptible to climate change and sea level rise. Of course, you have the United Kingdom, comprised of not just England, but Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland to the north. All right, so all four of them fall under the Union Jack, but they are distinctive regions, you know. Believe me, ask a Scot and they are Scottish. Yes, they might think of themselves as British, but they're Scottish. And don't call them English, call them Scottish. Same thing with Northern Ireland, which is separate from Ireland itself, Wales, and of course, the rest of it, England. You know, when you think about it, a place like England is just fascinating to read all the names because these are the names of towns where we live, whether it be Connecticut or New Jersey or New York or New England, get it? You know, here's York, New York. You have Cambridge, Oxford. You have, of course, Brighton, which you find in New York, Plymouth, which you find in Massachusetts, Falmouth, which you find in Massachusetts, Cardiff, all these different places that's all sort of borrowed name and naming conventions, Norwich, Connecticut, all these different places. And it's just fascinating to think about how they have translated into America and Canada as well as a function of the people that moved here and settled it. They weren't particularly clever with the naming convention. They just named it after what they already knew. So my brother in Rhode Island lives basically immediately next to Bristol, and so on. So anyway, just an interesting look at a place that has a lot of ties to the US. As you head further into Europe, of course, you get to Scandinavia, Finland, which is very tied to Russia, Sweden, and Norway. And then, of course, don't forget Iceland, another European country that often gets forgotten because it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, traversed by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, so it's a very volcanic island. And then you have, of course, Russia, this big, giant landmass, which basically has the biggest pine forest in the world. It's called the taiga, Tiaga, or boreal forest, or snow forest, however you want to think of it. Very, very cold, mostly deep climates. Really, the western portion of Russia is the most agriculturally productive. By the time you get out to the east, Siberia, it is a very cold, unforbidding landscape. Very, very harsh. Places like, let's see if it comes up here when I get up closer, but there's a place called Yakutsk in this area of Russia, and it is the coldest city on Earth. The names are slowly coming up. I don't know if it'll actually show up, but it's in this particular region right here. Notice the names are in Russian and in English. Here it is, Yakutsk. That city right there. And this is generally known as the coldest city on Earth, where the winter temperatures can drop to about -50 to -70 degrees. So it's basically in the middle of the continent, subjected to cold air directly out of the polar region. So it can also get pretty warm in summer. And in fact, in 2020, That city that I just mentioned reached a temperature of 100 degrees in Siberia. So that is a 170-degree temperature swing from winter to summer. So that's unusual. That doesn't happen there very, very often. Many people, of course, are tying that to climate change, the fact that a region so far north should never be that hot. So this region here in Russia and Siberia, former Soviet Union, bears the scars of a lot of nuclear weapons testing. The biggest nuclear weapon was detonated right here in this island. It was in response to a nuclear detonation that the Americans did back in the Pacific Ocean. Theirs was bigger and bombier, I guess would be the right term. So lots and lots of really polluted rivers throughout this whole region as a function of the fact that the Soviets were not particular environmental stewards, as they basically created many weapons of mass destruction back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, okay? So that's the tour, Google Earth, just to give you a sense. Again, you can see in the coloring how it goes from brown, so drier, to green as you go into the forest. Let me minimize that and go back to the lessons. So we'll begin with Europe. And my recommendation is watch these in installments, but I hope you watch them. Again, this is meant to show you the material beyond the book. I'm not going to cover everything the book covers. I'm going to go slightly, and I'm not going to show everything that this shows either. So it's just to get you to think about the region, think about the geography, think about how different each region is from every other region. So we'll begin with Europe. Again, some of the learning objectives and the key terms. Again, we've mentioned the fact that it's many countries, from large states in Germany to small ones. It's very relatively small compared to the US. It's about a third the size of the US. It has a very distinctive history in terms of cultural diversity, war, division. It's, you know, can't get away from that. And you have to think about the fact that here's, by the way, if you superimpose Europe on top of the United States and Canada, so it's basically about a third of North America, roughly. Notice how far north a place like Sweden and Norway and England would be compared to by latitude. So if you were to literally shift Europe over the United States and Canada, a good chunk of it is north of the Canadian border. And that pretty much tells you that there's something at play making Europe not that cold, because they should be a lot colder. Again, we'll talk about the complex regions and landscapes. And the big one is, of course, the Gulf Stream, that warm body of water that basically takes warm water and transports it to the north. And if you want to see that in action, let's look at this briefly and see that. Let me minimize this a bit, show it like that. Go here, go ocean, currents, and sea surface temperatures. And here you see the Gulf Stream, there it is, transporting warm water north towards Europe, bathing essentially Europe, which is a much higher latitude, in otherwise warm water. Therefore, their winters tend not to be as severe, okay? I mean, when you think about it, a place like Rome, Italy is at the latitude of Chicago, and they never get snow like they do. It doesn't get to be 20 below zero in the city of Rome, ever, or Barcelona for that matter, okay? So that's just to show you how the sort of the global circulation takes warm water and transports it to the north and to the northeast. All right, so back to this. Again, there's that Gulf Stream, a non-moving image, but to show you the fact that it is traveling in the direction of Europe. And as a result, you tend to have relatively mild climates. The climates are comfortable. European cat, there's a reason people like to live in the south of France, in Italy, in Greece, in the coast of the Adriatic, in Sicily. They're beautiful, beautiful climates. They're very comfortable. They're not too hot. They're not too cold. Even Paris and England and most of what we call Western Europe is relatively mild. Okay, the climate of extreme Western Norway is no colder than mid New York. And it doesn't usually snow as much because it's mostly very heavy rain. Now, once you get into the mountains, it's obviously different. And the further east you go, the colder the climates get into places like Poland and Lithuania and places like that. Okay? Some of the environmental issues, of course, there's a lot of World War II remaining issues that are being addressed quite nicely. But you have, of course, the idea of the Dutch coastline, low lying, threatened by sea level rise. You still have the issue of acid rainfall. And you have the issue of climate change, which, by the way, Europe is probably handling better than any other region of the world. Here's a place called Svalbard, and that is the global seed vault. And just to show you where this is a place that the Norwegians created where everybody can go in and basically put a little suitcase full of seeds of plants that grow in their homeland. And this is meant to be a global agricultural insurance. And just to show you where that is, Svalbard is right, there it is. There it is, this big set of islands belongs to Norway technically. It's one of the few places on earth where you can move to right now if you want to. You don't need a passport, a visa. You can just move there right now. Do it if you want. The Norwegians don't care. It's beautiful. It's ice covered, mostly frozen all the time. And that's, again, what it looks like. There's a video that's linked on Blackboard that kind of goes over this. It's built into the bedrock, and it's basically frozen all the time. Renewable energy efforts. Europe is now the fourth leading producer of solar panels and solar energy. And these are a little bit dated. I need to update it with the 2019 data, but there you see the rankings for 2017, 16, and 15. And of course, 2018 in terms of overall capacity. So China, the US, Japan, Germany, and then India, Italy, the UK, and France. So 4 of the top 10 has a combined solar capacity of 115 gigawatts. And frankly, this is going to increase more as we move through the 2020s. Germany reached 38% solar and renewable in 2018, and the goal is 65% by 2030. So whatever Germany doesn't renew in terms of like recycling, they incinerate and then they use other renewables. It's a remarkably good use of energy, and it's clean, and it basically removes the dependence on any other country into the future. So that's a good thing. That's a security issue. Again, some of the impacts of climate change. An issue here is these are the sea gates that you would find in the Netherlands, for example. And again, I think it's well worth it to go back over Google Earth and show you that, because you can actually see them from space. So zoom out and you go down towards the Netherlands right here, and you zoom in there, you actually begin to see all these sea gates. So let's zoom in. Here's one. Maybe hard to see it, but there's a sea gate right there. There are some more sea gates right there. Then you got another sea gates or barrier. There's another one. So their entire coastline is basically gated. And so this is something that they've taken great care and great expenditure to do in order to, here's, for example, the swing gates that basically close in. The ocean would be here. So when there's storms, they can basically close these gates and prevent the ocean from flooding into the land. So this is engineering at work. No one's better at it in the world than the Dutch. Notice wind power as well. Here's another example of using wind power in the Netherlands. But I want you to look at the scary image before you. These trucks and cars are way down here. This is the ocean up here. Ocean, way down here, cars. So yeah, they are below sea level. That's a very scary image, I think. But they make it work. No one's better at it than the Dutch. And here's an example of homes that are they float. So if sea level rises, they just go up with the tide. So it's an interesting way of living. I don't know if Americans could do this. And I say that simply because we're so used to our space and being spread out that this kind of living would take some getting used to. It would literally take a cultural shift over time. So who knows, right? I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about. Population. These are one of the Europe is one of the few places where countries are shrinking, where they have negative or slowing down natural increase, rates of natural increase, RNI. So here's, for example, the idea. Notice how many negatives you see in this bar. It's a lot of countries. Maybe a third of the countries are shrinking. And if they're not shrinking, they are awfully close to it. Here's Germany. Notice how the population has been paring down over time. Italy, Bulgaria. So there are pro-growth policies ongoing in a place like Europe. The idea of labor shortages and the idea of declining tax revenues is a significant factor, quite frankly. Migration, of course, you have to think about the idea of true migration, legal migration and illegal migration, whether it be from former colonies in Africa to what happened in 2015 with migration out of Syria through Turkey into Greece and then the rest of Europe. So economic reasons and refugees. Here's a look at a city like France, Paris. We'll talk about the idea of geopolitical change and how Europe has changed from the early 1900s to post-World War I to post-World War II to now basically post-Soviet Union / post-Yugoslavia. So you have a reunited Germany, you have a no longer Yugoslavia, you have these former Soviet satellites that are now their own independent countries: Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Here's the idea of contrast, the Brandenburg Gate. Here's an image, it's really well done during a Nazi parade. Here's Hitler, And that image on the other side is open and free. Here is the Israeli flag being painted with lights, LEDs. That's, wow, that would have, think about it. The Israeli flag, Nazis, get it? And here is the Union Jack painted on it. And of course, you have gay pride, the rainbow colors, on that very same image where Hitler once basically marched through. So it gives you a sense of how remarkably different this place is from what it used to be. And there it is. It's really there it is, that same Brandenburg Gate. There's the stuff on top. Here's the former Berlin Wall. So the epicenter of post-World War II / Soviet influence in Europe. So it's all kind of all coming together there. Some of the different languages spoken. And so in terms of Europe, this is where I'm going to leave it, this particular lesson. And we're going to move on to Eurasia and the the Russian domain. Again, if you want to take a break, pause it, come back to it. So here you have sort of the epicenter of Russia, Moscow. There you have the Kremlin. And you have all these very distinctive, very Russian-looking architecture. But this, depending on what book you use, same company, some of them focus on it being Russian domain, others, excuse me, Eurasia. I prefer Eurasia, quite frankly. So here's learning objectives, some of the key terms. Again, vast. 11 time zones in Russia alone. Mainland US only has 4. Again, there are some Russian videos linked on the class page, on the class YouTube page, and also on the folder for you to look at. Again, varied from volcanoes and volcanic landscapes in the extreme eastern part of Russia to fjords to, of course, very urbane places like Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. Environmental issues, the echo of the Soviet Union looms large, again, 1917 to 1991. Lots of severe air and water pollution, and of course, Chernobyl, which is now in the Ukraine rather than Soviet Union. So it's not in Russia, it's in Ukraine. In fact, there it is, just north of the city of Kiev. But these are some of the other issues. Anything in this sort of like pink lavender line would be a polluted river. There's a lot of polluted rivers. There's a lot of forest damage and deforestation. There's, of course, Chernobyl. And by the way, there's a great documentary on how they've completely contained that structure for at least another 100 years. They need to do it for another 9,900 years. That's how bad it is in that particular area. Russia and this region contains significant forests that are used for the paper industry. And it also contains this lake. It's called Lake Baikal, which has 20% of the fresh water in one lake. Fresh water, all of it on Earth, 20% of it is in this one lake. So it's a very deep, very long lake. About the diversity of landscapes. So of course, it is home to the most pine needle trees on Earth. Again, it's boreal, taiga, or pine forest. However you want to call it, it's a severe climate. Notice you find it in Russia, Northern Europe, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Canada, and Alaska. It's the only place on Earth where you find this environment, because it is the only place on Earth where you find the climate. In the Southern Hemisphere, you don't have this. because there are no D climates in the southern hemisphere. Too much water, too much ocean. And there you see the climate, mostly D climates with E climates at the very, very northern end, tundra, ET. And if you go to the very, very southern end, you find BSK. These are basically cold grasslands. By the way, there's a great documentary on Netflix. If you have Netflix, this is not a requirement, but there's a great 3-part series on aviation. And in episode 1, minute 41:36, it's called City in the Sky. They talk about how the airline industry handles those crazy cold temperatures, because aircraft are not really designed to function in 40 below zero weather. But yet they'd have to, because, well, this is, you know, the kind of climate that they're having to deal with. So climate change has some potential benefits, less severe climates. And from a Russian perspective, the oil exploration of the Arctic is more likely. And Russia claims a significant portion of it because they have a big, big coastline with the Arctic. So climate change isn't always bad. I know that's all you hear. It really depends, like real estate, where you are. Again, these are some other great, there's another video here. It's called The Great Human Odyssey. I really hope you watch this. It's an hour, it's over an hour long, but it's a really good documentary on the evolution of humans. And we're talking about over the last, you know, like humans as we know humans today, that evolution. And they talk about how people in this area of Siberia deal with these crazy, harsh winters. What are some of the benefits and what are some of the drawbacks? So if you go to minute 1, that's where they begin to talk about this population of native Russians. And when you see them, they look more Asian. They look more Eskimo, is the term that you would probably use. They look a lot more Asian than a typical Russian would. Yet this is present day Russia. Again, really in the western part is the most productive land, Ukraine. It's sort of like their equivalent of Kansas, Nebraska, the plains of the US. Population and settlement, of course, the majority of people are significantly clustered in the west, and the vast majority of the east is very lightly populated, very lightly populated. Again, fertility rates are exceptionally low. Again, in 91, you would still see the echo of Russia, of the World War II in Russia. There you see it. By 2018, that's sort of what it looks like. And here's what it looks like, the forecast for 2050. Basically, a place that is shrinking or at least stable, but significantly on the old side. There's the Ukraine. So, you know, it gives you a sense of what some of the challenges of a place like Russia are when you look at population. Let's see here. I'm going to go over to the Central Asia. Again, I'm not covering every single slide. These are available for you to look at. I want to cover some of the most significant aspects of the material, and then you can, through your reading and your study, sort of wrap it all together. Here's the idea of Central Asia. When you get to Central Asia, now you're talking about areas that are more, there's a definite Arab Muslim influence. Look at the architecture here. This is a Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Objectives and some of the key terms. Again, there's a couple of videos that are linked And the idea of this is an area that is considered landlocked. It's at the center of the Eurasian continent. Okay, so oh, I inadvertently started Safari, so let me quit that. So this right here focuses on, I like to call it the Himalayan wheel. And so we talked about Southwest Asia last week, Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, right? Now we're talking about Central Asia. We've talked about Russia. Eventually we'll talk about East Asia, China, Japan, Koreas, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So the Himalaya mountains function as a big wall, a big separator. And it separates culture, it separates language, it separates religion, it separates different peoples. Back before technology, it was the perfect wall, the perfect barrier, the perfect fence. And the Himalayas basically is a birthplace of some of the most significant rivers in the planet, including the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yangtze, the Yellow. Okay. In many places, the water is on the one side and the other side is very, very dry. So that matters. So setting the boundaries, the west is arid and flat. The east is wetter and more mountainous and harsher in climate. And here is Central Asia from the perspective of these stans. This is Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Okay. This is how, up until the most recent ISIS, that's funny, right? Up until the most recent SpaceX launch, which I believe took place in early July, and since the end of the space shuttle in 2011, this is the only way to get to the ISS. So we basically had to hitch a ride on a Russian spaceship that's ended as of 2020. So I had to update this slide, but this is Baikonur. And this is where Yuri Gagarin and the Soviets, basically raised the Americans to space. This is where it happened. This is called the Cosmodrome. It's their version of the Kennedy Space Center. This is, of course, Central Asia on the other side, much drier and mountainous. Again, there's the Tibetan Plateau, which has an average elevation of 15,000 feet. That's higher than the highest point in the lower United States. So the average elevation of the Tibetan Plateau is higher than any point in the US, not including Alaska. So that's remarkable how high up that is. Some of the environmental issues, and I'm going to focus on one, of course. Decertification is one, but another one is called the Aral Sea. So we'll talk about that. Again, decertification, when you decertify land and you take away all the moisture, what's left behind is salt, a lot more salt. So basically the soils become less useful. Here's the Aral Sea, that little red marker there. It's halfway in Kazakhstan and halfway in Uzbekistan. It roughly translates to Sea of Islands, which are basically many islands used to dot its full surface area. It's called an endorheic drainage basin, meaning it has no outlet. Anything that drained into it only drained there. It didn't drain away from that point. So it's a closed hydrologic system. It was once home to a very thriving fishing industry, which has been decimated. Back in the 1960s, the Soviets diverted the two lakes that fed it, the Amudarya and the Sirdarya rivers. And as a result, that alteration completely wiped this once fourth largest lake on Earth. It is now 90% smaller. So this is not a climate change victim, not a climate change victim. This is a completely human cause problem. This did not need to happen, even in a climate change world. So there are second and third order economic and environmental effects. So because it used to be a fishing industry, and now it received water from agriculture, that water has in it fertilizer, right? It has basically poop remains, and it has pesticides. Now, when that water dries, it leaves behind a very thin, powdery residue. And because it's dry, it becomes colder in winter and warmer in summer. And whatever winds happen, pick it up and transport it. So there's a health issue associated with it. This is what it looked like in 89, 03, 2009, and 2014. So it's been basically split into two. It used to be, notice, it used to be this entire area, right? This entire area has become this. This has been stabilized some. They've built a dam right about there. The dam has had positive effects in this region. This region will eventually dry up entirely. And every once in a while, if you have a particularly wet year, you might get a very, very shallow lake forming in the middle, but it always goes back to drying up. Again, this is, those boats used to be on a lake, and now all this very powdery, dry stuff can be picked up by the wind, and it has negative consequences because that powder isn't just dirt, it has pesticides and fertilizer in it. Here's the climate. The definition of the region is arid. So aridity is the one word I would choose. B climates, BW and BSK. Notice mid-latitude desert, mid-latitude steppe. And if you've never heard of the word steppe, a steppe would be like Western Kansas, Western Oklahoma, Western Texas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. That's a steppe. Decertification is, of course, a threat to a fragile environment. Decertification isn't just climate change. Decertification is also when people treat the land poorly and when they manage the land poorly. And as a result, you get fragile environments that go in a bad direction. So the Gobi Desert, for example. Another area, of course, is glaciers. Glaciers seem permanent, but they're not, and they often tend to be the ones that provide water. So many of the big rivers in Asia, again, the Indus, the Yangtze, the Yellow, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, these are all snow-fed rivers, and they depend on snow far, far, far up and glaciers to provide them with sort of a seasonal burst of water that over 2 billion people rely on for not only their drinking water, but also irrigation for crops. Here's the idea of population and settlement, a lot less populated, obviously. This is an area, many parts of the region, like Tibet and Mongolia, are populated at a rate of fewer than 6 people per square kilometer. There might be more people than that in your house. Get it? It's a very, very lightly populated area. Fertility rates are relatively high, comparatively speaking. However, they are dropping almost like everywhere else on Earth. And here's some of the population: Afghanistan, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. One thing that I wanted to go over in this particular lesson is the idea of, let me get to it here at the end. And this is social development and gender. And that's where I'm going to end that part of the lesson. The idea of human development index. So the closer you are to 1, the better. So look at a place like Afghanistan, 0.4. To give you a sense, the best country on earth in terms of all possible measures is Norway. And Norway has a human development index of 0.96. The US sits at 0.92. So you have a country like Afghanistan at 0.45. Gender equality, or inequality rather. So the higher the number, the worse. So in the lesson folder, there are videos related to this region, Central Asia, being probably the worst region on earth for women, especially Afghanistan. So let me just sort of take it back and make it from that perspective. And there's a couple of videos that talk about how Afghanistan is still the worst place to be a woman on earth, even in 2020. So there's some, there's some good videos that I've linked, and I hope you watch them. One is a part 1 and then a part 2. So it was a female photographer, and she does photography and photographic essays. And she focused on 7 women in Afghanistan and how very different those 7 women are. And then there was a follow-up to her story, which is, I think, really kind of cool. So, take advantage of it. I hope you watch it, because it'll give you a sense of, in this country, we're talking about inequality still. And yes, there is inequality. I'm not going to deny that. But you want to talk about inequality for women? Yeah, go to some areas in the Middle East, and in this case, Afghanistan. That's inequality. And it's inequality, at a variety of levels. Access to education, healthcare, just the way they're treated, that kind of a thing. So, just to give you a perspective. And those videos, again, are linked on the class page. So that's the lesson for today. I know I didn't cover everything in the slides, but the slides are there available for you. If you have any questions, of course, the lesson live office hour is on Wednesday, and that hasn't changed. If you have any questions, send me an email or contact me, and we can set up a live office hour that meets your timeline. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well, and I look forward to interacting with you again sometime, and best luck. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.